Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, the Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst in the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining an exciting and growing group of shows including The Bleacher Bunch, The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, Baseball Rabbit Hole, and Bricks Behind the Ivy. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and CubsPS Plus will always be available ad-free to Patreon supporters. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. A spin on the baseball metric, OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. If you can share this episode with a friend. It's February 5th, and while Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow, the Cubs are about to open spring training early. Pitchers and catchers report in a few days, but the offseason is still moving. Let's talk about those moves and what I got wrong and a little bit right about 2024. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 102. This week is flipping back to a jersey number. I'll go back and forth between jersey numbers and stats. This is one I missed the first time around because I wasn't doing this back in the early days of the podcast. But since a few days ago was the anniversary of the Cubs acquiring Ryan Sandberg and the Larry Bowa for Ivan De Jesus trade, this will be the Larry Bowa episode of this podcast. Bowa wore number 2 with the Cubs from 1982 to 1985, and he was a big part of that 1984 division-winning team that brought the postseason back to Wrigley Field for the first time in 39 years. Today, I got a series of topics. It's going to be a mixed bag. The offseason is still going, but it feels like it's almost over. Pitchers and catchers report on Sunday, on Super Bowl Sunday. The Dodgers and Cubs are reporting a little bit early because they have to go to Tokyo and play an early series in the middle of March. So we're going to start to see things coming out of spring training even faster than usual. So this is great. I want to talk about a couple moves that happened this week, one that's still being rumored, talk about what's left on the table, and then I want to get into both projections and take a look back at last year. At the end of every season, I like to kind of regroup and go over my notes before I do the next season's preview, predictions, all that kind of thing. I like to take a look at what I got right and what I got wrong. And last year, there's a lot I got wrong. Not necessarily in the way that I laid it out. I didn't see the season going the way it was. We'll get into it, but that's what I want to get into in this episode. And we'll get into the total predictions in terms of wins and losses. But to start, so yesterday, the Cubs completed a trade for Ryan Brasier from the Dodgers. Yeah, the Dodgers are interesting. They have been grabbing every free agent. I talked about that on the last couple shows, certainly the one after Cubs convention. And they have stacked up so much talent that they're at a point now. They have really good, viable players on their roster that probably aren't going to make the start of the season. They've got kids ready to move up and take major league roles that won't have an opportunity. And a guy like Ryan Brasier has had a lot of past success. He was actually pretty good last year. He's 37. I get why he's the one they cut ties with. But the Cubs picked him up. Will pay him $4.5 million. Although I've heard the Dodgers are going to put in some money towards that, so that remains to be seen. And the return on the trade is either cash considerations or a player to be named later. The player to be named later, anytime you do player to be named later, it's not going to be a major prospect, a major player. That said, I think we all know that it's going to be somebody who's not on Cubs 40-man because the entire reason that Ryan Brasier got designated for assignment was because the Dodgers had the roster crunch given all the free agents they've grabbed this offseason. So it's going to be either some lower level prospect, maybe not even a ranked prospect at all, or it's going to be some cash. Wouldn't be at all surprised if the Dodgers want to get through a little bit of spring training, probably get some scouts out and find somebody that they think they like. But the big news that's potentially still on the table is Alex Bregman. So Bregman, who's been with the Astros for years, had a really good career, really good player, pretty typically about a 4.5 win player. He's peaked up at the 5, 6, 7 range in the past. He's 30, looking for a free agent contract, and he's been looking for reportedly 6+ years and presumably 180 to 200 million or more dollars. His market hasn't been there. A lot like Matt Chapman, Blake Snell, Jordan Montgomery, and Cody Bellinger last year. There have been rumors he had turned down a 6-year, close to $170 million offer, I think. Maybe $168 million with the Astros before the offseason, late last season. There were reports early that the Astros had a 6-year deal on the table. There have been mystery reports that another team has had a 6-year deal on the table. That might have been Detroit. It's hard to tell. Some of these are just rumors. Some of them, even when they start to sound like facts, are leaks from an agent trying to pump up the players market a little bit. So it's hard to know what's what. But the long and short of it is we are now at February 5th and Alex Bregman is still unsigned. And so there was a report yesterday from Jacob Zanola, who's a new contributor, Cubs insider, Evan Altman, who said he was able to confirm with sources that the Cubs have an offer on the table for 4 years, north of $100 million. After that, there were some follow-ups. I don't know how well sourced any of these people are, including Jacob, calling out 4 for 104, up as high as 4 years, $119 million. We're now in the afternoon, nothing signed. So clearly nothing was imminent last night. Doesn't mean there's not an offer on the table. Also doesn't mean that that's not some dog and pony show coming from one side or another. Generally speaking, though, the leaks, Cubs typically don't. I mean, we saw that in spades when the Cubs hired Craig Counsell. Often these are coming from the player's side or maybe an opposing team trying to maybe quell a market. There are a ton of reasons why people would leak information. But so what about Alex Bregman? So Alex Bregman, I like Alex Bregman as a player. If he comes in, if the Cubs do sign him to a 3-4 year deal, he makes the Cubs better this year. I've seen a lot of complaints about, well, if you bring him in, you're blocking Matt Shaw or you have to trade Nico Hoerner. I don't think you have to do either one. What Alex Bregman does is brings you in more certainty. And I talk about it a good bit, not as much as Brendan Mill from CHGO Cubs. But we want to be able to project. We want to be able to have some hope, some room for the kids, but also have a certain amount of as much certainty as possible built into the lineup. When you look at the Dodgers, sure, anybody can have a bad year, anybody can get injured and all that stuff. But when you look at what you expect to get from that player, there's a lot of certainty with Freddie Freeman and Mookie Betts and Shohei Ohtani, Max Muncy, Will Smith. Those guys on the position side give you a lot of certainty. On the pitching side, not so much with the Dodgers. They have a lot of, if this guy's healthy, you have certainty, but you have a ton of uncertainty on whether or not those pitchers are actually going to be healthy. Other teams too, Braves and Phillies. Phillies have Kyle Schwarber, Bryce Harper, JT Realmuto, Aaron Nola, tons of guys that have plenty of track record of giving you a lot of things. Now with the Braves, Acuna now is starting to stack up the injuries, so there's some questions on that front. But for the most part, and then Austin Riley had a bad year last year, but Matt Olson, Ozzie Albies, those guys are going to give you typically what you expect to get. And Acuna absolutely will if he's healthy. So the Cubs want to build in that certainty. Without Alex Bregman, the Cubs likely slot in Matt Shaw to be the opening day starting third baseman. If the Cubs do not get Alex Bregman, I'm 100% fine with it. I'm fine with turning the position over to Shaw. The Cubs have some other options. They signed John Birdie. They've got, potentially Vidal Brujan, Gage Workman. There's some guys at AAA who could potentially play third base if Matt Shaw really struggles. There's also a chance he's going to go. There are concerns about Nico Hoerner. I've seen pictures of him out in spring training. There was a tweet today showing him playing catch at spring training, so I don't know how game ready he is. I don't know when he will be game ready. And so until we know, we don't know for sure if he will start the season. Again, the Cubs have options there. But I'm also not worried if the Cubs get Alex Bregman. If the Cubs get Alex Bregman, it doesn't mean that Matt Shaw is going to be stuck in Iowa for the next year and you're wasting a year of both control and his talent and his growth, because as we've seen, Pete Crow Armstrong, Michael Busch came up, had some success, but they had their struggles and they had to battle through and eventually had some really good moments last season. And you want to build on that. There's a certain clock that starts when a major leaguer comes up and starts facing major league pitching for the first time. So Matt Shaw is going to go through that just like everybody else does. But if the Cubs sign Bregman, you take a little bit of pressure off Matt Shaw. Everybody knows this is maybe a playoff season or bust for Jed Hoyer. But the Cubs have just missed the playoffs in 2023 by like a game. Last year they won 83 games and missed the playoffs by 5 or 6 games ultimately, but that's a season that felt like it should have been there. The Cubs had a really bad May and June. put 2 bad months together, dig yourself a hole, and they couldn't get out of it. But it feels like that team should have been. So with Bregman, without Bregman, I'm fine. You put him in there. I think the Cubs have done enough to improve the team to win. If the Cubs get Bregman, I'm also happy. I don't really like Bregman on a 5 or 6 year deal, but as I talk about on the show, assemble talent. If that means you overpay a little bit on a contract, I'm okay with it. So I don't think the Cubs are going to get him for 5 or 6 years, because I think if the Cubs were going to do that, he would already be a Cub and Jed would have done it 3 weeks ago. But if the Cubs get him for a 3 or 4 year deal with some sort of opt-out package and high average annual value, all that kind of thing like the Cubs did with Cody Bellinger, as Jed seems to like to do, you now plug in certainty at third base. Matt Shaw then becomes effectively the top guy off your bench. I still want Matt Shaw, unless he looks completely overmatched this spring. I still want him on the opening day roster. Maybe he's playing second base if Nico Hoerner isn't ready. But what we saw last year, we saw the Cubs have injuries. We saw some of the key players on the Cubs play through injuries, and it really detracted from their performance. So as the Cubs go through that this year, you want to have quality bench guys that Craig Counsell will trust and put in. You can't get through a 162 game season on effectively 9 position players and a very small handful of spot starts. So when I look at the paths for playing time for Matt Shaw, I see a lot of them. I see Nico Hoerner. They may want to start the season slowly with him. Even if he's ready, he's maybe getting a day off every week. Maybe he's getting 2 days off every 10 days just to make sure he's building up the right way, stays healthy over the course of the season. I've seen now over 2 years, Dansby Swanson loves to go out there, take the ball every day, go play shortstop, go do his thing. And he will do it 162 times if you let him. But he's 30 now. His body doesn't hold up the way it did before. And we've seen over the last 2 seasons him have some injuries, play through some injuries. But when he's rested, when he's come off the injured list, late last season, the Cubs went through about a 4 or 5 week stretch where they had a lot of off days and the guys stayed plenty rested. That's when Dansby Swanson looks good. So he doesn't have to play 158 games, 155 games. Why don't play 145, maybe 150? It's a long season. Get some time off. Same with Nico Hoerner. Nico played through a lot of injuries last year. Both Nico and Dansby had off-season surgery. I don't think either one was really ever fully healthy at any point last season. Get them healthy and let them stay that way. So when you look at Matt Shaw for playing time, obviously Bregman is 30. He'll get some days off at third base. When he gets a day off, Shaw plays third base. When Nico Hoerner gets a day off, Shaw plays second base. When Dansby Swanson gets a day off, Shaw plays second base and Nico slides over to shortstop. If Matt Shaw is killing the ball and you want to find still more opportunities without necessarily taking somebody else's job away, let's say the whole team's playing well. If you give an outfielder a day off, especially a corner one, Seiya Suzuki comes off the bench, plays outfield, and maybe Matt Shaw DHs. And then you give Matt Shaw a chance to not have the pressure of a must-win season kind of hinging on how he performs at third base. Honestly, the way the Cubs did with Christopher Morel last year. I'm going to talk about Morel later because he was one of my biggest stories identified before the season started, and I think that rang pretty true. But you take a little pressure off Matt Shaw, and if Shaw is hitting, if he comes up and hits the way we all think he eventually can, he's starting to figure pitching out, and he's really raking, guys can get a little more time off. You can be a little more aggressive about getting him in the lineup. You can even take somebody else out of the lineup. Maybe after a month and a half, maybe he goes and takes Nico's. Or maybe Dansby's having a rough go and they start giving, again, we're not talking about benching Dansby Swanson or necessarily Nico Hoerner, but let's let the Cubs have depth. One thing the Cubs really lacked last year, really the last couple of years, was good quality depth off the bench. So if you have Alex Bregman at third base, Nico Hoerner at second, Dansby at short, Bush at first, whoever's catching, Happen left, PCA in center, Kyle Tucker in right field, and Seiya Suzuki DHing, there's still going to come times where you want a pinch hitter off the bench. Or somebody's going to be struggling. Maybe they get dinged up, get hit by a pitch, got to come out of the game for precautionary reasons, something like that. I think the bench is kind of promising this year, but I still think they need that one more piece. And if they get Bregman, that one more piece is Matt Shaw. Matt Shaw is on the bench. He's there. He can go take in a bat. But also, as you rotate him through those rotations, and also depending on how they break up first base, maybe Alex Bregman plays a game or two over first base every so often, and then an opportunity for Matt Shaw to play third. But as guys struggle and as we go through the season, injuries, it's going to be really nice to have, you're going to have a starter quality bat on the bench every single day. If Hapa's getting a day off and Seiya moves out, takes left field, Shaw's DHing, you've got Ian Happ to potentially taking a bat off the bench. Now there's still, we'll see how the bench works itself out. If I were making decisions right now based on what they have, I would project it'd be 4 on the bench. So you've got your backup catcher. You've got Gage Workman is here unless the Cubs decide to give him back to Detroit. Let's say Matt Shaw and probably Alexander Canario unless they do something else. There are some other candidates in there. Oh, and John Birdie. So actually, if you get Bregman, it does raise some questions on the bench. Who gets that last spot, whether the Cubs keep Workman or not. But again, I say it a lot. Assemble talent and figure the rest out later. There's no need to not get Bregman because you're afraid to put Shaw at third base because it blocks him and just leave yourself weaker. If you can get that guy and it makes sense and he wants to come and you get the right price, go get him. But as I said, I'm okay either way. If they get him, great, I'm happy about it. If not, I'm not mad about it. I think the Cubs are still a better team than they were last year, are still the team favored to win the division, which we'll get into in a minute. But we'll go. The other thing I want to talk about with relation to Bregman is there's this sense of, well, if they get Bregman, then they have to trade him. They really don't. With the numbers we've seen tossed around, if the Cubs sign Bregman, he's probably their last move for the offseason. But that doesn't have to be the end of Nico Hoerner here. There aren't 7 more things the Cubs have to get. They don't have to free up that money. Even setting aside that the CBT as a threshold is merely a choice from the Cubs ownership. What I just said about the depth, about having the ability to have Shaw or somebody else starter level on the bench, only happens if you both sign Bregman and also don't trade Nico. Never mind like a trade now. Let's say the Cubs did sign Alex Bregman tonight or tomorrow. They're 2 days away from pitchers and catchers reporting to spring training. There are still free agents available on the market. The Cubs still could work a deal. But again, with the questions of Nico's health, close proximity to the season starting, uncertainty over bench roles and what Matt Shaw can be this year, and all those things, I would say just keep Nico. These things tend to work themselves out. Somebody gets hurt. Somebody has a bad season. Or, oh my gosh, if everybody rakes, the Cubs have too much offense. Well, that would be an amazing problem to have. That's probably not how it's going to work out, but that's fine. So get Bregman or don't get Bregman. But if they do, don't look for the Cubs to be in any kind of a rush to trade Nico Hoerner. I would say keep him and enjoy the depth. So let's get to projections. As the season gets closer, we saw a big one come out this week. PECOTA came out. They projected the Cubs at 90.6 wins, which is 3rd in the National League, 1st in the NL Central, and 5th in baseball overall. That was a little higher than I expected, I'll be honest. They have the Brewers at 80.5 wins, the Cardinals at 78.2, the Pirates at 75.2, and Cincinnati at 73.6. Fangraphs also has theirs out. They have the Cubs at 84, Milwaukee at 81, St. Louis at 79, Pittsburgh at 78, and Cincinnati at 78. And I'll go ahead and hit the betting lines in there. I went and looked at a bunch of different betting lines on the over-under win totals. And most of the betting lines, most of the sports books have the Cubs between 85.5 and 88.5. Personally, I think the Cubs are somewhere in between, probably more along the lines of where the upper lines are. If I were going to lay it out right now, and the offseason's not done, so this is not my official prediction for the season, I'd probably have them about 87, 88 wins. But that can sway because I think one of the reasons why they got to 90.6 in PECOTA is, where they have the rest of the division. I'm not quite seeing the Cincinnati being as low as they are. I think Cincinnati could actually kind of be a sleeper in this division. They've upgraded manager. They've got good pitching. They've made a couple sneaky acquisitions. And they have a lot of young players who spent a lot of last year injured. So they have the upside and the downside. But seeing them at like 73.6, right now I'm not seeing it. We'll see what happens when we get into spring training, get everybody's rosters finalized. But I think if they Pacoda having the Cubs or NL Central kind of that down overall, no other team over 500, that's probably naturally going to add a few to the Cubs total. And then Fangraphs had a little bit lower. I think Fangraphs has the Cubs too low, but they have much more of a cluster. Everybody's going to be closer, probably beating each other up a little more. Cubs maybe not taking advantage of some of the wins. The betting lines, like I said, I think 87, 88 is probably pretty good at the moment. I think this team is clearly better than they were last year. The bullpen is better. The bullpen deeper. The starting rotation is deeper. We'll see if it's better. I think it's going to be hard for it to be much worse. I think a couple individuals could take a little step back. Shota Imanaga may have had the best year of his career last year. Not that I expect him to fall back big time, but I could see a little regression. I think Justin Steele is going to do his thing. I think Jameson Taillon is probably going to do his thing. And after that, we're replacing the combination of everything that Javier Assad, Ben Bregman, Jordan Wicks, Kyle Hendricks gave to the last two spots in the rotation. And Colin Ray gives you some stability. Matt Boyd gives you some potential upside if he can stay healthy. You've also still got Wicks and Assad and Brown, Cade Horton and Brandon Birdsell to try to compete for those other spots. So there's a chance for it to be significantly better. It's hard for me to say it's better on paper than it was last year, but I do think the depth is certainly as good or better. So I'll do my predictions for this year a little bit later. We'll get it in before the Cubs play the Dodgers in Japan. But I want to see the rosters get a little more settled. Whatever I predict for the Cubs today, around the 87, 88 win total, that changes if they bring in Alex Bregman. It changes if they maybe don't get Bregman, but maybe they make a trade for a starting pitcher or something. There are a lot of things they could do that would change my outlook on this. But for the rest of the day, I want to get into where we stand looking back at last year. So last year in my season preview episode, which is episode number 73, if anybody wants to go back and hear it, I laid out my 5 big stories heading into 2024. And then I made my season predictions on win totals and how I thought that would go in terms of playoffs or not. And my number 5 story going into last year was bullpen management. And I was right that this would be one of the big stories. It just didn't go the way I thought it would. So coming off the 2023 season when the Cubs really struggled with that bullpen for a long time, but eventually settled with Adbert Alzolay closing, Julian Merriweather in a setup role, Mark Leiter Jr., Michael Fulmer, all contributing, and some young kids occasionally doing some more, really relying on those 4. It was a really good pen down the stretch when the Cubs were hot and making their run back into playoff contention, but those 4 guys there were some injuries in the season, and ultimately that cost them the playoffs. So what I wanted to see out of the team last year is I wanted to see a better and deeper bullpen, and I wanted to see better usage of it from a game management situation. And I thought with Counsell on board and the fact that they had Jose Cuas, they had Yency Almonte, they signed Hector Neris, they had Luke Little emerging and some other young pitchers that looked like they would come up. I thought that gave them more quality depth, more good options. And I thought that Craig Counsell, who had been a bullpen wizard in Milwaukee, would have the tools he would need to make things work. In the end, he did. The second half of the Cubs bullpen was very good, but they were very good because the personnel changed. The personnel the Cubs started with either didn't pitch or didn't pitch. So we all know Adbert really struggled early. I'm not sure he was ever healthy, but then he got hurt, missed the rest of the season, and had Tommy John surgery. Julian Merriweather missed almost all of the season. Hector Neris, we'll never know what he could have been. He was not what we were hoping to get, but also we didn't get to see him very long in that 6th, 7th inning role that would be sitting behind Alzolay and Merriweather. Leiter was good, ultimately traded to the Yankees. Almonte looked really good early, got hurt, and then missed the rest of the year. Luke Little came in, had some ups and downs, but then he looked really good for a stretch before he got hurt. So I'm optimistic about him going forward. Jose Cuas, my biggest miss. I was fine with the trade. I kind of liked it at the time. Even going into last season, I said in that episode 73 that Jose Cuas gave me a bit of a Pedro Strop vibe, although he was hats to the right instead of hats to the left. Turns out hats to the right is completely the opposite of hats to the left. And Cuas he does have really good stuff. He's got a ton of movement. He can't control anything of it. And so ultimately he was DFA'd. I think he went to Toronto after that, was DFA'd by the Blue Jays too. So I wish him the best, but that did not work out. They also had Drew Smiley. I thought that was enough depth to get them through the season. Turned out, between the injuries and underperformance, it was not. The Cubs bullpen was a disaster for the bulk of the first 3 months. There were moments where Ben Brown came in and gave them stability. He pitched some really big innings. Then he got hurt. There were a bunch of guys that came up and gave little spurts. And then in the end, they added Tyson Miller. They added Jorge Lopez. The second half, they started picking up guys in trades and waiver claims like Nate Pearson, Jack Neely. They added a ton of arms at the end of last season, which now, we'll get into it. I think this might be the number one story for 2025 as well. I do think now they are actually better positioned, but we're going to have to see it play out. I understand those who might be a little bit skeptical. So my number 4 story last year was bench roles. One of my big frustrations in 2023 was the way David Ross used the bench. Too many guys, too much letting Dansby Swanson go every day. I've already talked about this on this podcast. And the bench wasn't very good. But also the bench wasn't very good when it didn't get to play. Miles Mastrobuoni was a popular whipping boy for the last 2 seasons. We saw in 2023, he struggled, was up and down with Iowa. Then there was a stretch in July and August where Dansby Swanson and Nico Horner were both injured, kind of overlapping and independently, where Nico had to go slide and play some shortstop. And Miles came up and played more consistently. And he actually hit really well during that stretch. So my frustration was, number one, is the bench this bad? Or 2, are they this bad because they never get reps? And so to start last season, they started with Mike Tauchman, Garrett Cooper, Miles Mastrobuoni, Nick Madrigal, Miguel Amaya. And I say Miguel Amaya because Young Gomes, I think, started as the official starter, but maybe you flip that. And I thought, again, Council's strength in Milwaukee always seemed to be making efficient use of the bullpen and getting a lot out of his bench guys. And so I thought that was going to happen. I was not thrilled overall about the depth, the strength of that bench last year. But I did think they would play more. And I thought if they played more, I thought you would see more from Miles Mastrobuoni. I was never a fan of Nick Madrigal, not in a long time. And I really specifically didn't like having both Patrick Wisdom and Madrigal on the same roster. And Wisdom was hurt to start last year, so he wasn't one of the bench guys I named. You can have Wisdom or you can have Madrigal. They give you different things. But having them both is redundant and just poor roster construction, in my opinion. I thought Council would deviate from those raw strategies. He really didn't. And I guess we'll find out this year how the bench goes, if some of the kids come up, whether last year was more a function of the Cubs as an organization make the lineups, and that's what the Cubs organization does, and maybe that continues. Or did Craig Counsell just not really like his bench and have some guys there that he didn't think were good fits, and so he kept going with the other players? I think it's very clear the Cubs rarely make a Rule 5 call on a position player, so I think they see a lot in Gage Workman. I'm not sure Vidal Bruin's going to make the opening day roster. I think they like John Birdie. He's a good addition. He can play a lot of positions, and he can be a professional at bat. What are the Cubs going to do with Matt Shaw, Alexander Canario, any other kids that come up? We'll see. But that's one where I thought Council would figure it out, and I'm not sure he ever really did. But it may not have been Council. It may have just been the parts. My number 3 story from last year was, how would the Cubs create space for the kids? And so heading into last year, the Cubs had Jordan Wicks, PCA, Michael Busch, all as top 100 prospects, really beaten down the door for the major leagues. All had made their major league debuts in prior seasons. The Cubs picked up Busch because he was blocked and there was no space in LA. But that's going to happen when you're behind Freddie Freeman, Mookie Betts, and Max Muncy at the positions you play. So the Cubs, as expected, they turned, I'll even throw Christopher Morel into this. He wasn't quite the young player anymore. He had been a rookie in 2022, had a nice offensive 2023 season. And so the question for 2024, and it's actually my biggest question, so I'll talk more about Morel later, was could he make the step and take a position of his own? So the Cubs created space for Morel. They created space for Bush opening day. Those were your starting corner infielders. PCA went down. It made sense. The Cubs had Cody Bellinger, Seiya Suzuki, and Ian Happ in the outfield, and they had Mike Tauchman as the fourth outfielder. So at that point, it's hard to, PCA didn't seem like he was ready. You could tell he was getting close, but not ready. And you just want him to go back down and swing everything. Well, there were injuries early. He got called up, and the Cubs made some space. They said they were going to play him during the injuries, and when the injuries were over, he was going to go back down. And that's what they did. Then there was another injury, and then they decided it was time to just let PCA. He struggled for a good while. First month plus, he was in the major leagues. He was really not a starting caliber player, but his glove played in the outfield, and the Cubs felt that getting those reps in, investing in him as a player and getting that learning curve going was worthwhile. And it paid off. He was a good player in the second half. He ran down a little bit in September, but he was really good in July and August. So would the Cubs create space for the kids? Yes. Also, no in some cases. Alexander Canario was up a few times, never got much play. Matt Mervis was up a couple times, got a little run, not much. I think the Cubs organization kind of gave up on Mervis, and maybe it was the right call, but again, I've talked about it a lot. Are you going to create the space to get these players the 200, 250 plate appearances needed to really make a legitimate assessment on what kind of player they are? So the Cubs were a mixed bag on space for the kids last year, but I thought in the end, and on the whole, it was a positive. I thought it would be because of Counsell, and I think Counsell gave me about where it was expected. There was some frustration about not giving Canario a little more time. There were times Luis Vasquez was up and just didn't play at all, whereas he could have given somebody a spot start, like getting a bat or two. But that's okay. This year, that's going to be a big question too. How are they going to work Matt Shaw in the lineup? If there are injuries in the outfield, do they move to start getting Owen Casey or Kevin Alcantara a chance to come up? Does James Triantos come up? What about Ben Cowles that was added to the 40-man roster? The Cubs are getting to the point where a lot of their depth right below the major leagues is really good at AAA. So instead of fishing out to grab a veteran that was maybe just DFA'd, I think the Cubs will start more and more to those kids. But we'll see how it goes. My number 2 question last year was, what are the Cubs going to do with Nick Madrigal? I was optimistic about him. I have a hard time saying I ever really liked him. He's not really my favorite style player. But when the Cubs traded for him, along with Cody Hoyer, who I actually thought was the bigger get in the trade, and turned out nobody wound up happy from that trade because Kimbrel was terrible with the White Sox, and then the Cubs had Madrigal and Hoyer. That's an everybody lose trade. I didn't really like him. He works hard. He's a good contact bat. Before he really stacked up the injuries, when he was playing in Chicago, he was able to hit 320, 330. If he can hit 320 plus, he makes up for the fact that he doesn't take walks, so his OBP becomes okay. He doesn't give you power or on-base percentage, so I have a hard time with just batting average. I don't hate batting average as a metric, but I hate it when that's the main thing a player gives you. And defensively, he was okay at second base. He was never going to play shortstop. I didn't like him at third base. He did work really hard and got himself to be pretty passable over there. But all the jokes about Nicky 5 steps, having to field the ball and like take a couple shuffles to get a good throw off, he just didn't have the body or the arm strength for third base. And he had to play so shallow pretty much in all situations that he really gave up a lot of balls that maybe a third baseman who could play a deeper third base might get to. And the whole Nick Madrigal thing just didn't work last year. He didn't play well early. He had some struggles, got sent down. As soon as he got sent down, he got hit in the hand by a pitch, and that took him out for the rest of the year. As I said when talking about Patrick Wisdom, he was not a good fit for this roster. On a different roster, if there's a team that needs a backup second baseman, guy who can be a little bit of a utility infielder, maybe play some third base, and you just want somebody in your bench that can go make contact, he could be a guy for a team like that. The Mets just signed him. I'm not sure exactly how they're planning to use him, but that's probably what they were looking at. The other assessment I had on him last year was that my struggle with him, while I didn't like his game or his fit on the roster, was that he was too good to designate for assignment and just release. And that just proved to be false. The Cubs really should have cut bait with him early in the season. The biggest question for me last year was, could Christopher Morel take over third base? And Morel had a terrible season. I don't know how much of that was trying to play third base and struggling there. Defensively, he was really rough early, but then he went through a stretch where he was pretty good. Clearly a good athlete. He made a lot of athletic plays, has a huge arm. On the whole, he was a below average defensive third baseman. Some people would make it out to be that he was an absolute train wreck over there. I don't think he was that bad. He wasn't strong, but what I wanted to see out of him was enough defense to justify keeping his bat in the lineup. And unfortunately, he really struggled to hit last year. And I don't know, he had a lot of really hard hit contact early, but then faded late. I don't know if he got bought too much into sort of the BABIP luck. There was definitely some BABIP luck there. He also has some pull tendencies, are very clear and maybe make him a little bit easier to position defensively. But I'm not sure what really drove the struggles last year. Maybe it's just a bad year. Sometimes a guy just has a bad. Maybe it's because he was maybe playing third base disrupted him a little bit. Hard to say. The year before, he mostly played DH. Put up, I want to say 118 WRC plus. Definitely above average with a good amount of power. But he wound up being traded to Tampa for Itzhak Perez, who's now been shipped off to Houston, along with a package for Kyle Tucker. So that's worked out, but those didn't work. And so when you look back at, let's do the prediction now. I predicted 89 wins. I thought the Cubs were going to be significantly better and deeper in the bullpen. I liked the rotation. I liked the addition of Shota Imanaga. I thought Jameson Taillon would bounce back, which he did. I thought the Cubs would be healthier and more productive, but the middle infield was not healthy. Cody Bellinger regressed a little, was not healthy. He also played through a ton of injuries. Christopher Morel stepped back. I thought the Cubs would be 89 wins, clearly the division favorite. A lot of the projection models had Milwaukee falling off last year. I wasn't seeing it to the level they were, but I did think Milwaukee would fall off. They lost Brandon Woodruff. They lost their manager. They had lost Josh Hader at the end of the season before. But it turns out that machine just kept rolling. So what I used to call Cardinals devil magic has really become the Brewers devil magic. I think that they look to decline this year, but as I've said on social media a few times, I'll believe Milwaukee's dead when I see the body. So I expect them to be competitive. I don't fully believe that they're going to be at 80.5 wins while the Cubs are over 90. I could see that playing out, but I don't think that's the most likely scenario. And so I didn't think St. Louis actually wound up right around where the projection was. I didn't think St. Louis would be, they were around their projection. I thought that they were going to be a little bit below that. The Reds' injuries were a big question. They had a ton of them last year. So I thought if the Milwaukee fall off was real, the Cubs would be in a position to really add, maybe make a big move or two at the deadline and pass 90 wins. But I settled on my prediction as 89. I think that's kind of where the Cubs are this year. So we'll see how I do my breakdown later. But when you look back at what I got wrong, and I was wrong on the predictions. The previous year I was right. I predicted 83 wins. They got 83 wins. Of course, I'm not going to pat myself on the back because they didn't get those 83 wins the way I thought they would. The season didn't go as I expected, but I thought last year was a playoff team, and they didn't get. But I think I was right in the key themes I laid out for the season: bullpen management, bench roles, space for the kids, and then Nick Madrigal and Christopher Morel. I think, unfortunately, not only was I wrong on the bullpen management and bench pieces, sadly, I think I was right about Madrigal, except for I did say he was too good at DFA, so I missed on that one. I guess my biggest misses on the year were Jose Cuas being a Pedro Strop vibe and Nick Madrigal being too good to DFA. So I did not have that going for me last year. I thought Morel could take over third base. But when you look at those 5 categories, huge bullpen struggles, very little value for the Cubs off the bench, a little bit of space for the kids. I'll grant that one as a positive, and Council did okay there. Nick Madrigal gave you nothing. Christopher Morel gave you very little. That's how a 89 win projection turns into 83 wins. And honestly, there were some upshots. I mean, Shota Imanaga came over better than I expected him to be. The Cubs bullpen did get to a place where it was better than I expected it to be in the second half. Michael Busch played well. The Cubs did see growth out of Pico Armstrong. The starting pitching was largely good on the season. Ian Happ had another good season. Seiya Suzuki needs to stay healthy, but when he was healthy, he hit. those things kind of carried the Cubs, because when you look at the bullpen failing, the bench giving you nothing, a couple players not filling the roles you thought they were going to fill, it's a recipe for a bigger disaster than it turned out to be, which probably falls to some extent at the feet of Craig Counsell. He's a good manager. So pay attention to Bregman. We'll see what the Cubs do in the next few weeks. I'm going to do a season preview. I'll definitely get it out before the Cubs play the Dodgers, probably for maybe early March 1st, March 10th, somewhere around there. And we'll see. But I want to see what the Cubs do. Pay attention to the Bregman news. If some reports are to be believed, he may be a Cub in the next day or two. If it's all just smoke, we'll see. The longer this stays in, the more we get some of these reports. I don't know if the Cubs will get him, but I think there's actually some fire here, not just smoke. So I think the odds of this are way higher than I thought they were a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago. So we'll see. Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share the episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!